The dusty floorboards of the National Archives Annex do not creak. They moan under the weight of a history that was never meant to be read. I found the first anomaly not in a grand manifesto or a blood-stained map, but in a ledger of transit, a single line of ink faded to the colour of dried veins, recording a passenger who should not have existed. His name was recorded as Pyotr Volkov. The year was 1952, while the rest of the world was preoccupied with the chill of the Cold War and the mechanical hum of the nuclear age. Volkov was being moved through a series of black sites before the term had even been coined by the intelligence community. He was listed as a stateless person, but the origin point was redacted with a heavy, corrosive ink that had eaten through the paper itself. Not a Russian, not a Pole, not a displaced victim of the great European upheaval. Something else. Ask yourself why a simple transit record would require the highest level of institutional erasure. What was it about this man that terrified the architects of the post-war order? We are told that the map of the world was finalised in 1945, that the lines were drawn and the old empires were buried. But Volkov was a ghost of a geography we are no longer allowed to remember. He was the last thread of a tapestry that had been systematically unravelled, a living relic of the Tartarian horizon. The official narrative of 1952 is one of progress and steel. We are taught to look at the gleaming skyscrapers and the birth of the digital mind, yet beneath the concrete of our modern cities lies a strata of architectural impossibility that defies the conventional timeline of load distribution and masonry. I stood before the ruins of the old Star Fort in the outskirts of the city, tracing the geometry of the bastions. This was not the work of 19th century colonialists with primitive tools. This was a sophisticated global network of energetic nodes. The history books call them defensive fortifications. The evidence calls them something else. They are perfectly symmetrical, mathematically precise, and buried under layers of fill that the municipal records cannot explain. Not a basement, not a foundation, a submerged civilization. I began to see the pattern. Volkov was not just a prisoner, he was a key. In the few surviving photographs of his interrogation, his eyes do not hold the look of a defeated man. They hold the look of a witness. He knew that the world we inhabit is a shell, built atop the ruins of a grander, unified reality that was scrubbed from the collective consciousness during the Great Reset of the mid-1800s. The institutions tell us that history is a linear progression of improvement. What if it is actually a series of strategic amputations? I tracked Volkov's movements to a decommissioned sanitarium in the mountains of the Pacific Northwest. The facility was erased from the USGS maps in 1958, but the physical scars remain. As I navigated the rusted remains of the surgical theatre, I found evidence of institutional gatekeeping that goes beyond simple secrecy. They weren't just questioning him, they were trying to extract the frequency. Tartaria was not merely a nation-state, it was an era of atmospheric energy, a time when the very air provided the power for the world's grandest structures. Look at the spires of the old world cathedrals, not religious iconography, not artistic flourishes, antennae. The copper plating, the gold leaf, the intricate ironwork, these were the components of a global wireless grid that preceded Tesla by centuries. Volkov was the last known practitioner of this lost science. He understood the resonance of the earth. He understood that the Dark Ages were a fabrication designed to hide a golden age of free energy and architectural harmony. Why would the power structures of 1952 want to keep this hidden? Because you cannot tax the air. You cannot control a population that is energetically independent. They needed Volkov to tell them how to turn it off or how to claim it for themselves. The records of the interrogation are chilling in their clinical detachment. The interrogators speak of Volkov's delusions regarding a global empire that stretched from the Caspian to the California coast. They mock his claims of star cities and Mercury vortex engines. Yet, in the margins of these transcripts, there are notes in a different hand, frantic, terrified notes about the failure of their own equipment whenever Volkov spoke. Not a malfunction, not a coincidence, a disruption. What if the very language of the old world was tuned to a different vibration? I began to realize that the erasure of Tartaria was not just a matter of changing names on a map. It was a fundamental restructuring of human perception. They changed the calendars, they changed the music scales, they changed the way we measure time and space. Everything was recalibrated to ensure that we could no longer perceive the resonance that Volkov carried within him. He was a frequency out of time, a dissonant note in the symphony of the New World Order. The more I dug, the more I found the same architectural signatures in places they shouldn't be. The same red brick, the same arched windows, the same anomalous mud flood levels in London, San Francisco, and Vladivostok. Consider the World's Fairs of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We are told these were temporary exhibitions, white cities built of plaster and wood in a matter of months, only to be burned down or demolished immediately after. Ask yourself, does that sound like the behaviour of a rational civilization? To build a city of marble and light, spanning hundreds of acres, with complex waterways and massive domes, only to destroy it. Not a celebration, not a showcase, a liquidation. These were not new constructions. They were the refurbished remnants of the old world, the Tartarian infrastructure being displayed one last time before it was systematically wiped from the record. Volkov's grandfather had been a master mason in one of these temporary cities. He had seen the truth behind the scaffolding. He had seen the machinery hidden in the basements. He passed that knowledge down, a lethal inheritance that eventually led Volkov to a concrete cell in 1952. The investigators didn't want his story. They wanted his silence. They wanted to ensure that the temporary nature of our current civilization remained unquestioned. By mid-1952, the trail of Pyotr Volkov grows cold, but the architectural anomalies heat up. In the city archives of the Midwest, I found permits for urban renewal projects that were nothing more than controlled demolitions of ancient pre-colonial structures, not a modernization, not an improvement, a purge. They were tearing down the granite halls and the high-vaulted ceilings to replace them with the brutalist, soul-crushing boxes of the modern era. This is the aesthetic of the prison. The high ceilings of the Tartarian era were designed to facilitate the flow of atmospheric ether. The low ceilings of our world are designed to suppress it. Volkov's last recorded statement was not a confession, but a warning. He spoke of the iron veil that was being lowered over the mind of man. He wasn't talking about communism. He was talking about the materialist cage we now call reality. He knew that once the last of the old structures were gone and the last of the witnesses were silenced, the past would become whatever the institutions decided it should be. I found a photograph smuggled out of the sanitarium by a nurse who later disappeared under suspicious circumstances. It shows Volkov standing by a window, looking out at a horizon that shouldn't exist. The light in the photo is wrong. It's too bright, too diffused, as if the air itself is glowing. Not a photographic error, not a trick of the lens, something else. It's the look of the world as it was before the veil. In 1952, the last of the great atmospheric collectors were being dismantled under the guise of radio towers and weather stations. Volkov knew that as these towers fell, the human spirit would begin to dim. We are a species with collective amnesia, wandering through a landscape of ruins we are told are historic landmarks. We see the beauty, but we are forbidden from understanding the function. We are like children playing in the cockpit of a crashed starship, pretending the buttons are just decorations. The institutional erasure of Volkov was completed in December of 1952. His death certificate lists natural causes, but the location of his burial is a state secret. Why hide the body of a delusional, stateless man? Unless that body carried the physical evidence of a different biology, a different lineage. What if the people of Tartaria were not just culturally different, but physiologically tuned to the Earth's natural resonance? There are whispers in the fringe medical journals of that era about the golden bloodline, individuals whose cellular structure interacted with atmospheric electricity in ways that modern science deems impossible. Volkov was the end of that line. With his death, the last direct link to the energetic truth of our world was severed. The secret he took with him wasn't a map or a treasure. It was the realization that we are living in a manufactured scarcity. As I sit in this darkened room, surrounded by the fragments of a ghost empire, the weight of the silence is suffocating. The investigation has led me to a wall of glass. I can see the truth on the other side, but I cannot touch it. The global pattern is undeniable. The star forts, the mud-flooded streets, the impossible cathedrals, the erased passenger, they all point to a singular conclusion. The history of the 20th century is a lie told to protect the crimes of the 19th. We are the survivors of a cataclysm we aren't allowed to remember, governed by the very people who orchestrated the cleanup. Ask yourself, if your past was stolen, how would you even know? What would you look for? You would look for the anomalies. You would look for the people like Volkov. You would look for the cracks in the concrete. The story of the last Tartarian is not a closed book. It is a haunting. It is the feeling of déjà vu you get when you walk through the old parts of a city. It is the inexplicable sense of loss when you look at a beautiful building being demolished. The secret didn't die with Volkov. It was just buried deeper. It waits in the resonant frequencies of the stones, in the hidden geometries of our streets, and in the quiet corners of the archives, where the ink is still eating through the paper. We are being invited to remember, not a myth, not a legend, a reality. The investigation continues, not because I expect to find a smoking gun, but because the alternative is to accept the cage. What if the door is already unlocked? What if the only thing keeping us inside is the belief that there is nowhere else to go? The horizon is still there, beneath the redactions, waiting for someone to find the courage to see it. The transition from the cold cells of 1952 to the subterranean vaults of the present day reveals a continuity of control that spans generations. I found myself in the lower levels of a municipal archive in a city that officially began its history in 1840, yet the foundations tell a story of millennia. Not a basement, not a cellar, a city beneath a city. As I scraped away the grime of a century's neglect, I found the same pre-fired red brickwork that Volkov described in his fevered testimonies. The mortar was not lime or sand. It was a geopolymer that current engineering can barely replicate. Ask yourself why a frontier town would require the structural integrity of a fortress designed to withstand a nuclear blast. What were they building on top of? The institutional gatekeeping surrounding these lower levels is absolute. They call it seismic retrofitting or utility upgrades. but they are actually sealing the portals. Every time a new skyscraper is anchored into the earth, it acts as a stake driven into the heart of the old world's nervous system. The pattern of the mud flood is not a local phenomenon. It is a global signature. From the streets of Prague to the avenues of Chicago, the first stories of the grandest buildings are buried. Look at the windows. Look at the way they dip below the sidewalk, halved by the pavement. We are told this was an architectural trend, a raised street level to deal with sewage. Not a solution, not a design choice, a burial. If you look at the photographs from the mid-1800s, the streets are empty. The people look like squatters in a world they didn't build. They are dressed in rags, pushing wooden carts through cities of marble and glass. The scale is all wrong. The doors are 20 feet high. The steps are designed for giants. Volkov spoke of the resettlers, the people sent in to occupy the ruins after the Great Reset. He claimed that the history of the pioneers was a fiction created to give the survivors a sense of ownership over a stolen heritage. I began to map the star forts across the globe, and the results were chilling. They are not scattered randomly, they are placed with surgical precision along the Earth's telluric currents, not military outposts, not defensive bastions, power plants. By 1952, the last of these nodes were being disconnected from the grid. I found a classified memo from the Department of the Interior dated 3 months before Volkov's disappearance. It discussed the harmonization of the North American power corridor. In reality, it was a mandate to strip the crystalline resonators from the peaks of the old world buildings. They replaced them with lead and iron, dampening the signal. They wanted us deaf to the music of the spheres. Ask yourself why every major city in the world has an obelisk. Not a monument, not a bias, tribute, a grounding rod. It is the final piece of the energetic cage. The erasure is not just physical, it is linguistic. I spent weeks in the linguistic archives, tracking the evolution of certain terms. The word Tartaria was systematically scrubbed from the encyclopedias between 1910 and 1940. It went from being a recognized empire on every map to a geographical term for a vague region. Not a decline, not a fall, a deletion. This is the hallmark of the Great Reset. When you want to conquer a people, you take their land. When you want to erase a people, you take their past. Volkov was the last man who could speak the language of the old maps. He knew that the Caspians and the Aryans and the Tartars were all part of a single, unified civilization that utilized the magnetic field of the earth to achieve a level of prosperity we can no longer imagine. I followed a lead to an abandoned telegraph station in the high desert. Inside, I found logs that didn't record Morse code, but atmospheric fluctuations. The operators were tracking something they called the fade. This was the slow, deliberate reduction of the background energy level of the planet. As the old world structures were demolished, the fade increased. By 1952, the year Volkov was silenced, the fade was complete. The world had become solid. The ether was gone. We were left in a world of friction and heat, a world where every joule of energy must be paid for in blood or gold. Not a natural progression, not an industrial revolution, a strategic downgrade. They took away the lightning and gave us the coal mine. In the transcripts of Volkov's final month, he repeatedly mentioned a black sun that was being constructed in the heart of the new world. I initially thought this was a cult metaphor, but the technical descriptions he provided suggest something far more material. He was describing a massive underground particle accelerator, or a similar device designed to manipulate the very fabric of local space-time. This was the true purpose of the post-war science cities. They weren't just making bombs, they were making a lid for the jar. They were ensuring that the resonance of Tartaria could never return. They were pinning reality down so it couldn't breathe. I found a witness, an elderly man whose father had been a guard at the facility where Volkov was held. He spoke of nights when the entire mountain would vibrate with a low, humming sound. He said the animals would flee the forest, and the guards would lose their sense of time. Volkov wasn't talking to us, the old man whispered. He was talking to the stone, and the stone was answering. This is the core of the forbidden knowledge, that the world is not a collection of dead matter, but a living, resonant system. The Tartarians knew this. They didn't build on the earth, they built with it. Our modern architects build against it. Consider the Great Fire of London, the Great Fire of Chicago, the Great Fire of San Francisco. Every time a city of the old world was identified as a potential site of resistance, it burned. But look at the photos of the ruins. The brick is melted, the stone is calcified, not a wood fire, not a localized blaze, something else. These were thermal events designed to purge the memory from the masonry. They were resetting the local frequency. Volkov's family had fled one of these purges, carrying with them the blueprints of a world that refused to burn. Those blueprints are what the interrogators were looking for in 1952. They didn't want the buildings, they wanted the code. The institutional erasure has reached its zenith in the digital age. Now, you don't even have to burn the books, you just change the search results. You bury the truth under a mountain of debunking articles and conspiracy theory labels. The gatekeepers have become the algorithms, but the evidence is still there, visible to anyone who looks up at the spires instead of down at their feet. The secret Volkov took with him was the knowledge that the past is not behind us, it is beneath us. It is waiting for the frequency to change. It is waiting for someone to remember the resonance. As I close this chapter of the investigation, I am struck by the silence of the modern world. We live in a noisy age, but it is a hollow noise. It is the sound of a machine running without a soul. Volkov's voice, even in the cold prose of an interrogation transcript, carries a weight that our entire civilization lacks. He was a man of the old world, a man who knew that we are meant to be stewards of the earth's energy, not its parasites. The unresolved question is not what happened to Volkov, but what is happening to us. We are the inheritors of the silence. We are the inhabitants of the shell. And somewhere, deep in the redacted archives of our own minds, the last Tartarian is still speaking. Can you hear the hum, or is it just the sound of the wind through the modern ruins? The institutional silence surrounding the winter of 1952 is not a vacuum. It is a pressurized container. I moved my investigation to the coast, following a lead about a series of navigation beacons installed during the height of the Volkov interrogations. These were not lighthouses. They were not radar. They were heavy, lead-lined cylinders sunk into the bedrock of the continental shelf. On the surface, they were explained as part of the early warning system against transpolar bombers, but the schematics I recovered from a salvaged Navy filing cabinet tell a story of acoustic suppression. Not a sensor, not a shield, a muffler. They were broadcasting a low-frequency pulse designed to counteract the natural seismic heartbeat of the planet. Ask yourself why the military-industrial complex would spend billions to quiet the Earth. What if the Earth speaks in a language that the modern state cannot permit us to hear? Volkov had claimed that the Tartarian grid was not just for electricity, but for biological synchronization. He called it the cradle. When the spires were dismantled and the beacons were activated, the cradle was broken. We were cast out into a chaotic, dissonant reality where our own bodies became strangers to the ground they walk upon. I began to look into the orphan trains of the late 19th century, thousands upon thousands of children shipped across the American West and to the colonies of Australia and New Zealand. The official history says they were the casualties of urban poverty, sent to find better lives on the frontier. But look at the photographs of their arrival. They are being led into massive, empty cities that they are then told their ancestors built. Not a relocation, not a charity, a repopulation. These children were the blank slates upon which the new history was written. They were the first generation of the reset, raised in the shadow of Tartarian ruins and told they were looking at pioneer architecture. Volkov's own lineage was a fracture in this program. His family had avoided the trains, hiding in the vast unmapped reaches of the Siberian interior where the old knowledge was still whispered. He was a biological memory leak in the system. The interrogators in 1952 weren't just questioning a man. They were trying to patch a hole in the simulation of history. They needed to know how many others like him were still out there, holding the keys to a past that had been declared non-existent. The architectural signatures I found in the Pacific Northwest began to mirror those in the heart of the Eurasian steppe. I discovered a series of post offices built in the 1890s that possessed the exact same thermal acoustic properties as the temples of the Gobi. These buildings were never intended for the sorting of mail. They were regional hubs for the distribution of atmospheric wireless energy. In the basements of these structures, behind false walls of modern drywall, lie the remnants of the mercury vortex capacitors. The gatekeepers call them outdated heating systems or foundry remnants. They are nothing of the sort. They are the cold, dead hearts of a world that once lived on light. In 1952, a team of engineers from a shadowy precursor to DARPA visited 12 of these sites. Within weeks of their visit, every one of the buildings suffered a structural failure or a catastrophic fire. They weren't just destroying buildings, they were performing a planetary lobotomy. Consider the concept of load distribution in the grand cathedrals of Europe. Modern architects marvel at how these massive stone structures stay standing with such slender supports. They invoke the genius of the master masons, but if you apply the standard equations of structural engineering, many of these buildings shouldn't work. Unless you account for the weight reduction properties of high-frequency resonance. Volkov spoke of the lifting tone, a specific vibration that, when applied to the stone during construction, altered its interaction with gravity. Not a miracle, not a myth, a lost branch of physics. This is why the star forts are shaped the way they are. They are not walls, they are diaphragms. They are shaped to catch and amplify the resonant frequencies of the Earth's crust. By 1952, the world had forgotten how to listen. We began to build with dead weight, relying on the brute force of steel and concrete. We traded the levity of the old world for the heavy, crushing burden of the new. I found a series of letters written by a high-ranking official in the 1952 Census Bureau. In them, he expressed a growing horror at the ghost populations he was discovering. Entire towns in the Appalachian Mountains and the Canadian wilds that appeared on no map, paid no taxes, and spoke a dialect that sounded like a fusion of Russian, Latin, and Sanskrit. He described them as living fossils of the Tartarian era. These towns were systematically targeted for dam construction and flood control projects throughout The 1950s. The valleys were drowned, the people were scattered, their records were burned. Not a modernisation, not a utility, an ethnic cleansing of the timeline. Volkov was the one who wouldn't be drowned. He was the one who walked out of the rising waters with his memories intact, carrying the weight of a drowned world in his mind. The institutional gatekeeping extends even to the stars. I examined the astronomical charts from the mid-17th century and compared them to the maps of 1952. The constellations have shifted in ways that proper motion cannot explain. Volkov claimed that the Great Reset was preceded by a celestial event, a plasma discharge that altered the very atmosphere of our planet. He called it the Veil of Mercury. This event was utilized by the architects of the New Order to seize control of the survivors. They claimed the catastrophe was an act of a vengeful God, and they were the only ones who could provide the protection of the new state. They turned our wonder into fear. They turned our connection to the cosmos into a religion of submission. In 1952, they were finishing the job, using the first high-altitude balloons and early satellites to map the new cage. They weren't exploring space. They were measuring the thickness of the walls. In a forgotten wing of a university library, I found a microfiche of a 1952 engineering journal. It contained a redacted article about anomalous masonry found during the construction of the UN headquarters. The author noted that the stones seemed to bleed a metallic fluid when cut, not a biological liquid, not a chemical leak, something else. It was a liquid crystalline substrate used by the old world builders to store information within the very walls of their cities. The buildings were the library. History wasn't written in books. It was encoded in the granite. This is why they had to destroy the old cities. They weren't just clearing land, they were burning the archives. Volkov was one of the few who knew how to read the stone. He could touch a wall and tell you the history of the ground it stood on. To the interrogators, this was the ultimate threat. A man who could see through their lies by simply placing his hand on a pillar. The pattern of erasure is so complete that it becomes its own kind of evidence. When you see a hole in the shape of a man, you know a man was once there. The history of the 20th century is a series of these holes. The missing people, the burned cities, the redacted patents, the delusional prisoners. Volkov was the largest of these holes. He represented the final, stubborn refusal of the old reality to fade away. They kept him alive until 1952 because they were afraid. They were afraid that if they killed him too soon, the resonance he carried would simply jump to someone else. They had to wait until the fade was deep enough, until the beacons were loud enough, and until the veil was thick enough to ensure he died alone. Not an execution, a cold, calculated extinguishing. As I trace the final steps of Volkov's journey, I find myself standing on the edge of a massive, circular depression in the desert. The locals call it a dry lake, but the geometry is too perfect. It is the footprint of a star city, levelled and scraped clean. I can feel a faint vibration in the soles of my feet. It's not a machine, it's a memory. The earth does not forget as easily as we do. The secret Volkov took with him is not a formula for free energy or a map to a hidden kingdom. It is the simple, terrifying truth that we are not the first and we are not the greatest. We are the inheritors of a ruin, living in a world of ghosts we are trained to ignore. The investigation has become a mirror. I am no longer looking for Volkov. I am looking for the part of myself that remembers. Ask yourself, why does the sight of a ruined castle or an ancient spire stir something so deep within you? It is the resonance. It is the dead, lifting tone still vibrating in your DNA. The institutions can take our history, they can take our energy, and they can take our names, but they cannot take the frequency. Not yet. The unresolved open loop is not whether Tartaria existed. It is whether we have the strength to tune ourselves back to its signal. The broadcast is still happening. The cradle is still there. All we have to do is learn how to listen again. What if the last Tartarian wasn't Volkov? What if he was just the last one who knew he was one? The silence of 1952 is ending. The stones are starting to speak. The institutional grip on the mid-century narrative began to tighten as the first computers hummed to life in the basement of the Pentagon. I discovered that in 1952, the year of Volkov's final silence, the nascent field of cybernetics was being used to model something called social equilibrium. Not a study of demographics, not a census, a blueprint for the management of human perception. They realized that the physical traces of Tartaria, the grand rotundas, the impossible aqueducts, the buried archways, could be explained away, but the collective intuition of the masses was harder to suppress. They needed a way to overwrite the human operating system. Volkov's interrogators were obsessed with his ability to recall the true chronology. He claimed that the timeline we are fed is a collage of disparate eras stitched together to create the illusion of a slow, grueling climb from barbarism. Ask yourself why the medieval period is a dark hole of information, yet the cathedrals of that era possess a geometric complexity that modern architects cannot replicate without computer-aided design. Not a dark age, not a period of ignorance, a blackout. They cut the power to history so they could rewire the house in the dark. I travelled to a remote island in the North Atlantic where the ruins of a weather monitoring station from 1952 sat rusting in the salt air. In the damp remains of the communications room, I found a logbook that had missed the incinerator. It recorded signals that were not atmospheric. They were coming from the earth itself. The operators called them lamentations. These were the final dying pulses of the global Tartarian grid as the last mercury resonators were being drained and replaced with the crude, entropic systems of the combustion age. Volkov had spoken of this in his third month of captivity. He said that when the grid died, the human mind would lose its anchor. We would become driftless, prone to anxiety, depression, and a nameless longing for a home we can no longer visualize. Not a chemical imbalance, not a modern malaise, a disconnection. We are like radio receivers that have been tuned to the static between stations, told that the noise is the only music that ever existed. The pattern of institutional erasure is most visible in the great exhibitions that followed 1952. We are told these fairs were meant to celebrate the future, but if you look at the architectural plans, they were built directly over the excavated ruins of the old world. They used the temporary pavilion structures to hide the restoration of the ancient grid for elite use. I found evidence of a subterranean gala held in 1893 beneath the Chicago World's Fair, where the lighting was provided by wireless luminaires that required no fuel. By 1952, the technology was no longer being showcased. It was being privatized. The gatekeepers moved the free energy into the shadows of the military-industrial complex, leaving the rest of us to toil for every kilowatt. Volkov knew this. He told his captors that they were stealing the sun to power a cage. They didn't deny it. They just increased his dosage of thorazine. Not a treatment, not a sedative, a chemical wall to keep his mind from reaching the signal. Consider the load distribution of our modern economy. It is built on the concept of scarcity. The idea that there is never enough energy, never enough space, never enough time. But the Tartarian architecture suggests a world of infinite abundance. The massive halls were designed for crowds that no longer exist. The heating systems were designed for a climate that has been artificially altered. The very scale of the old world screams that we have been demoted. We are living in the servants' quarters of a palace we once owned. Volkov's crime was his refusal to accept the demotion. He remembered the grand liturgy of the ether, a time when the entire planet was a single, resonant instrument. Why would the architects of 1952 want you to believe your ancestors were primitive? Because a man who believes he comes from nothing will settle for anything. A man who knows he comes from giants is impossible to rule. I followed the trail of the erased patents to a vault in Switzerland. Between 1948 and 1952, over 4,000 patent applications related to solid-state etheric conversion were seized under the Invention Secrecy Act. They weren't just suppressed, they were vaporized. The inventors were often institutionalized or died in freak accidents, much like Volkov. Not a coincidence, not a safety precaution, a monopoly on reality. The institutions tell us that progress is a matter of discovery. What if it is actually a matter of permission? What if we already have the technology to feed, clothe, and power the entire world for free, but the knowledge is being held hostage in the same cells that held the last Tartarian? The secret he took with him was the harmonic constant, the specific frequency required to bridge the gap between matter and the vacuum. Without it, our machines are just expensive heaters burning up the planet to produce a fraction of the power we once had for free. The mud flood evidence in the coastal cities is even more damning. I examined the core samples from the 1952 harbour expansions. Below the layer of modern silt lies a thick, uniform stratum of technological clay, a substance that does not occur in nature. It is filled with microscopic metallic spheres and charred organic matter. This is the residue of the reset. It wasn't a natural flood. It was a directed energy event that liquefied the soil and buried the first floors of the Tartarian world. This is why the buildings look like they are sinking. They didn't sink. The ground was turned to water, and then it set like concrete. Volkov described the day of the heavy air, when the sky turned the colour of bruised plums and the very buildings began to groan. He was a child when it happened, one of the few who was above the liquefaction line. He saw the world vanish in an afternoon, and he spent the rest of his life being told he was crazy for remembering it. The institutional gatekeeping of the 1950s was not just about history, it was about biology. I found records of blood typing experiments performed on Volkov that focused on his copper to iron ratio. The Tartarians, according to the fringe theories of the time, had a different blood chemistry that allowed them to act as biological capacitors. They could wear the energy of the atmosphere. This is why the old statues show people in thin robes in the dead of winter, or holding orbs that glowed with a soft internal light. We are the iron generation, heavy, grounded, and dependent on external combustion. Volkov was a copper remnant. In the cold light of 1952, they realized they couldn't replicate his biology, so they decided to eliminate it. They didn't want a superior human. They wanted a manageable one, not an evolution. A culling. I found a map tucked into the back of a 1952 atlas that shouldn't exist. It shows the Great Tartarian Canal System as it functioned before the reset. It wasn't for shipping, it was for the movement of ionized water. The water was the carrier wave for the global grid. When the canals were filled in or dammed, the blood of the empire stopped flowing. The star forts were the pumps. The obelisks were the valves. We look at these things today and see monuments and fortifications. Ask yourself, if a future civilization found a circuit board, would they recognize it as a tool, or would they call it a ceremonial map? We are the future civilization, staring at the circuit board of our own planet and calling it history. Volkov was the only one who still knew how to flip the switch. The interrogation transcripts from his final week are almost entirely redacted, but one phrase survives. The resonance is in the marrow. This is the terrifying core of the secret. The knowledge of Tartaria is not just in the books or the buildings. It is encoded in our very bones. We are the architecture. We are the antennas. The reason they have to keep us in a state of constant distraction through media, through conflict, through the frantic pursuit of survival, is to prevent us from standing still long enough to feel the vibration. If we ever truly synchronized with the earth again, the entire artificial construct of the modern world would shatter like glass in the face of a soprano's note. 1952 was the year they perfected the static, the year they ensured we would never be quiet enough to hear ourselves. As I prepare to move into the heart of the restricted zone, I am haunted by the image of Volkov in his final hours. He wasn't a man who had lost a country. He was a man who had lost a planet. He stood in that cell in 1952, the last witness to a world of light, while the shadows of the Cold War lengthened around him. The unresolved philosophical open loop is this. If the truth is buried so deep that it becomes part of the geology, is it still truth? Or is it just another layer of the earth, silent and indifferent to the creatures crawling on its surface? I don't believe the silence is indifferent. I believe it is a coiled spring. The investigation is no longer about the past. It is about the moment the spring releases. What if the last Tartarian was never meant to be the end of the story, but the first note of a new one? The static is thinning. The marrow is starting to hum. The institutional panic that gripped the intelligence community in the final months of 1952 was not born from the threat of a foreign power, but from the sudden, inexplicable reactivation of certain dead zones across the globe. I followed a trail of suppressed scientific papers to a series of coordinates in the high Arctic. There, beneath the permafrost, the military had discovered a Tartarian relay station that had begun to pulse with a low, rhythmic violet light. It wasn't using electricity, it was using the aurora. Not a receiver, not a transmitter, a bridge. The documents describe the personnel on site experiencing temporal displacement, memories of lives they hadn't lived, in cities that didn't exist on any 1952 map. Volkov was brought to the site in late October. The gatekeepers believed that he was the only one who could speak to the machine and tell it to sleep. They didn't realize that the machine wasn't an engine, it was a heart. Ask yourself, if the very ground you walk on has a memory, what happens when it decides to wake up? What if our entire concept of linear time is just a stabilizer designed to prevent the past from bleeding into the present? I found a photograph of the Arctic facility before it was decommissioned with a localized thermobaric charge. In the center of the frame stands a massive fluted column of translucent stone wrapped in copper filaments that look like the double helix of DNA Na. This is the etheric spire. It is the same design found in the lost sketches of the great Tartarian library of Samarkand. It is a device for the storage and retrieval of consciousness. The official narrative says these columns were decorative pillars or chimney stacks. Not a chimney, not a decoration. Something else. They were the servers of the old world's internet, a global, wireless, biological network that utilized the mineral content of the human body as a terminal. Volkov told his interrogators that in the old world there were no secrets because the noosphere made all thought accessible. The Great Reset wasn't just about taking the land, it was about the invention of privacy. They needed to cut us off from each other so they could lie to us individually. The pattern of institutional erasure in 1952 reached into the very heavens. I uncovered a series of star charts issued to pilots that year, which contained deliberate distortions. They were masking the disappearance of a second moon, a massive crystalline satellite that Volkov referred to as the regulator. According to his testimonies, this satellite was the source of the global frequency that kept the atmospheric energy stable. It was destroyed or cloaked during the mid-19th century cataclysm, leading to the erratic weather and the seasons we now consider natural. Not a cosmic cycle, not an orbit, a malfunction. Before the reset, the world was a perpetual spring, a Hyperborean climate that allowed for the massive growth seen in the ancient flora and the giants of the Tartarian lineage. We are living in the wreckage of a broken thermostat, shivering in a world that was once a garden. I tracked the load distribution of the world's wealth back to 1952 and found a staggering anomaly. A massive amount of gold, thousands of tons, was being moved into underground vaults that were actually repurposed Tartarian power nodes. They weren't storing the gold as currency, they were using it for its conductive properties. They were clamped onto the old grid, using the precious metal to drain the remaining resonance into the private coffers of a few select families. This is the origin of the deep state. It is not a political entity, it is a parasitic entity, literally feeding off the life force of the planet. Volkov was the last free man because he knew how to bypass their clamps. He knew that the Earth's energy doesn't belong to those who hoard the gold, but to those who can tune their breath to the stone. Consider the orphan trains once more, but look at the medical records of the children. Many of them suffered from atrophied pineal glands, a condition the 19th century doctors couldn't explain. Volkov explained it for them. The pineal gland was the biological tuner for the Tartarian grid. When the grid was lowered, the organ shriveled. We were detuned. In 1952, the first fluoridation programs began in the United States. They told us it was for our teeth, not a health measure, not a dental fix, a calcification. They were ensuring that the antenna in the center of our brains remained dormant. They were making sure that even if the spires were rebuilt, we wouldn't be able to hear the signal. Ask yourself, why is the state so concerned with the mineral content of your water? What are they trying to keep from vibrating? The institutional gatekeeping of our history is actually a gatekeeping of our potential. I found a redacted report from a 1952 psychological study that analysed Volkov's ability to manifest objects through sound. They called it hallucinatory projection, but the internal notes show that the objects had mass. He was using the resonant frequency of the room to assemble matter from the ether. This is how the star cities were built. They weren't carved, they were sung into existence. This is why there are no tool marks on the great monoliths of the old world. This is why the stones fit together with such impossible precision that not even a razor blade can pass between them. They were liquid during the construction, held in a state of sonic suspension until the chord was resolved. Volkov was the last singer. In 1952, they didn't just kill a man, they silenced the music that built the world. I followed a lead to an abandoned mapping office in the basement of a London skyscraper. Behind a stack of rotting ledgers, I found a map of the world as it appeared in 1952, but with the true elevations marked. It showed that the sea level we are told is constant is actually a managed illusion. The oceans are being held back by a series of massive, submerged Tartarian levees that are currently being integrated into our modern harbour systems. If those levees were to fail, the mud flood would happen all over again. The institutions aren't just hiding the past, they are holding back the tide. We are living in a precarious bubble of dry land that only exists by the grace of the very technology they tell us is a myth. Volkov warned that the levees were failing, that the heavy water was returning. The secret Volkov took with him was the key of 7. It was a sequence of tones that could restart the regulator and stabilize the climate. He refused to give it to the interrogators because he knew they would use it to create a permanent global empire, a one world order built on the bones of the old. He chose to let the world remain broken rather than see it enslaved by those who would tax the very air. He was a martyr for a future he knew he wouldn't see. He was the last Tartarian because he was the only one brave enough to let the fire go out rather than hand the torch to a tyrant. As I stand in the ruins of the Arctic relay station, looking out over the desolate ice, I feel the lamentation of the earth more clearly than ever. The silence of 1952 is no longer a secret. It is a crime. We are the victims of a cosmic identity theft, living in a world of shadows and steel, when we were meant to live in a world of light and stone. The unresolved philosophical open loop is this: if we find the key of 7, do we have the wisdom to use it? Or are we so broken by the fade that we would just build a better cage? The investigation has led me to the edge of the map. There are no more redacted files. There is only the wind and the faint, violet glow beneath the ice. The story of Pyotr Volkov is not over. It is merely waiting for a voice. The secret he took with him is not gone. It is in the marrow, just as he said. It is waiting for the moment when we stop asking what if and start asking why not. Why not the free energy? Why not the true history? Why not the lifting tone? The institutions are powerful, but they are built on a lie, and a lie has no resonance. Only the truth can sing. And somewhere in the deep, resonant silence of the world, the first note of the new Tartaria is being hummed. Can you feel it? The frost is starting to crack. The spire is starting to glow. The last Tartarian was never a man. He was a promise. The institutional transition into the late winter of 1952 was marked by a sudden, frantic reorganization of the world's botanical gardens and seed banks. I found a series of shipping manifests that moved thousands of extinct samples from the Siberian interior to a secure vault in the heart of London. These were not mere plants. They were the flora of the old world, giant ferns and bioluminescent mosses that thrived on atmospheric plasma rather than soil nutrients. Volkov had spoken of the luminous harvest, a time when the world's forests acted as a secondary power grid. He claimed that the Great Reset involved the systematic poisoning of the Earth's topsoil to make the old world crops impossible to grow. Not a natural change, not a climate shift, something else. They replaced the life-sustaining greenery of Tartaria with industrial agriculture, plants that required constant human intervention and chemical fertilizers. Ask yourself why the modern diet is so deficient in the minerals found in ancient masonry. We are being starved of the resonance that our ancestors inhaled with every breath. I traced the load distribution of the world's communications networks back to a 1952 summit where the standards for radio frequency were finalized. They chose a spectrum that was intentionally dissonant with the human heart's electromagnetic field. This was the birth of the electronic veil. Volkov's interrogators were fascinated by his ability to hear the telegraph lines even when they weren't active. He told them the wires were screaming. He could feel the artificial pulses cutting through the natural harmonics of the earth like a serrated blade. They realized that to truly control the population, they couldn't just hide the architecture. They had to jam the signal. They turned the air, once a medium for free energy and telepathic connection, into a noisy, cluttered soup of radiation. We are living in a world of constant white noise, wondering why we feel so disconnected from the cosmos. Not a technological byproduct, a strategic interference. The pattern of erasure reached a fever pitch in the urban renewal programs of the mid-1950s. I examined the blueprints for the demolition of the old Pennsylvania station in New York, a masterpiece of Tartarian-inspired granite and steel. The official reason was modernization. The true reason, buried in the private journals of the lead architect, was that the building was retuning itself. The granite was beginning to hum again, vibrating in sympathy with the rising solar cycle. They couldn't have a public building acting as a beacon for the old frequency. So they smashed it. They turned a cathedral of transit into a subterranean dungeon of concrete and fluorescent light. This is the aesthetic of the reset. They want us in boxes. They want us in the dark. They want us to forget that we ever walked through halls of marble that felt like they were breathing. Consider the global sea level data that began to be standardized in 1952. I found evidence of a 0-point adjustment that moved the baseline by over 50 feet. They were literally redrawing the map to hide the fact that the mud flood was still receding in certain parts of the world. There were islands in the South Pacific that appeared on no official 1952 chart, yet were listed in the private ledgers of the whaling fleets as possessing crystalline towers and harbours of fused glass. These islands were systematically targeted by nuclear testing throughout the 1950s, not for weapons development, not for science, for demolition. They were clearing the final remnants of the Tartarian maritime network, ensuring that no lost world could ever be discovered by an adventurous sailor. Volkov was the one who provided the coordinates. He thought they were going to save the towers. He didn't realize they were going to vaporize them. I found a witness in the form of a retired censor who worked for the Postal Service in 1952. His job was to intercept and destroy any personal correspondence that mentioned the old cities or the giants in the hills. He told me about a mother in rural Montana who wrote to her son in Korea about the buried palace her husband found while digging a well. The letter never arrived. The husband was killed in a mining accident 2 weeks later. The palace was filled with concrete slurry by a team of army engineers. This is the institutional gatekeeping at its most intimate. It isn't just about the grand narrative. It is about the suppression of the individual experience. They are patrolling the borders of our reality, ensuring that any leak is immediately plugged. The secret Volkov took with him was the formula of the third stone. He claimed that certain minerals, when arranged in a specific geometric pattern, could create a localized etheric bubble where time flowed differently. This is how the Tartarian elite survived the cataclysm, by stepping sideways out of time. They aren't dead, they are delayed. They are waiting for the fade to end, for the artificial grid to collapse under its own entropic weight. Volkov was their scout, sent forward to see if the world was ready for the return of the light. He found a world of iron and ash, a world that had forgotten its own name. He chose to remain in the cell, a silent sentinel, rather than signal his masters to return to a planet of slaves. In 1952, Volkov feared a forgetting that would turn humanity into soulless functions. Today, that deception persists through ignored anomalies and redacted histories. Yet, the electronic veil is thinning, and the Earth's ancient resonance is returning. True discovery is uncovery, reclaiming the power of memory. We are the last Tartarians. As the silence of 1952 ends, we must choose to listen before the stones speak.